In the scorching desert of Afghanistan, Sarah Martinez never thought her gentle hands, trained to heal and comfort wounded soldiers, would one day grip an assault rifle with deadly precision. She had joined the army as a medic, driven by a desire to save lives, not take them. But war has a way of rewriting even the most peaceful soul's destinies. When the Taliban ambushed her medical convoy on a routine evacuation mission, Sarah faced an impossible choice: watch her patients die while hiding behind her ambulance, or pick up the fallen weapons around her and become the soldier she never wanted to be. In that moment, the quiet girl from small-town Texas discovered a warrior's heart beating inside her chest. This is the true story of how an ordinary ambulance driver became an unlikely hero, proving that sometimes the greatest courage comes not from those who seek battle, but from those who are forced to find their strength when everything they believe in is under fire. Sarah Elena Martinez grew up in the small town of Kingsville, Texas, where the biggest emergency was usually a cattle accident on Highway 77 or someone getting hurt during the annual rodeo. Her childhood home sat at the end of a dusty road, surrounded by mesquite trees and the endless stretch of South Texas ranch land. Her father, Miguel, worked as a paramedic for the county, while her mother, Rosa, was a nurse at the local clinic. From the time she could walk, Sarah was surrounded by medical equipment, first aid kits, and stories of people whose lives had been saved by quick thinking and gentle hands. When Sarah turned 8, she witnessed something that would shape the rest of her life. Her younger brother Carlos, only 5 at the time, fell from the old oak tree in their backyard while trying to rescue their cat. Sarah watched in horror as Carlos hit the ground hard, his small body lying motionless in the dirt. While their mother was at work and their father was responding to an emergency call across town, Sarah was the only one home with Carlos. Instead of panicking, something calm and focused took over her mind. She remembered watching her parents work countless times, remembered the conversations around the dinner table about keeping airways clear and checking for responses. Sarah gently shook her brother's shoulder and called his name. When he didn't respond, she carefully tilted his head back slightly, just like she had seen her father do. She checked to make sure he was breathing, and then she ran to call 911. Carlos had suffered a concussion and a broken arm, but the paramedics who arrived told Sarah's parents that her quick thinking and calm response had potentially prevented a much worse outcome. From that day forward, Sarah knew she wanted to help people in their worst moments. She began following her parents to work whenever possible, learning about medical procedures, studying anatomy books meant for adults, and practicing basic first aid on her stuffed animals. In high school, Sarah volunteered at the local fire department and became certified as an emergency medical technician before she even graduated. Her teachers noticed her exceptional grades in science and math, and many encouraged her to pursue a career as a doctor. But Sarah was drawn to the immediate, hands-on nature of emergency medicine. She loved the idea of being the person who arrived when someone's world was falling apart and helped put it back together. After high school, Sarah faced a difficult decision. Her parents had saved money for her college education, but it wasn't enough for medical school, and the family couldn't afford to take on significant debt. She watched her classmates head off to universities while she worked at the local clinic, saving money and trying to figure out her next step. The answer came when Army recruiter Sergeant First Class Williams visited the clinic where Sarah worked. He had come in for a routine checkup and struck up a conversation with Sarah about her medical training. When he learned about her background and her desire to become a paramedic, he told her about the Army's Medical Specialist Program. The military would provide advanced medical training, give her real-world experience, and pay for her education. After her service, she would be qualified to work as a paramedic anywhere in the country. Sarah spent weeks researching military medical positions. She learned about combat medics, field hospitals, and the critical role medical personnel played in saving lives during deployments. The idea of serving her country while pursuing her passion for emergency medicine felt like the perfect solution. Her parents were initially worried about the dangers of military service, but they also understood that this opportunity could give Sarah the career she had always dreamed of. On a warm September morning in 2018, just 3 months after her 19th birthday, Sarah raised her right hand at the military entrance processing station in Houston and swore to defend the Constitution of the United States. She was officially a soldier in the United States Army, assigned to train as a 68W Combat Medic Specialist. Basic training at Fort Sam Houston was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The physical demands were intense, but the mental challenges were even greater. She learned to think clearly under pressure, to make life-or-death decisions in seconds, and to function effectively even when exhausted, scared, or overwhelmed. Her drill instructors pushed her beyond what she thought were her limits, teaching her that the human body and mind could endure far more than most people realized. During medical training, Sarah excelled in every area. She learned to start 4 lines in moving vehicles, perform emergency surgery in field conditions, and treat wounds that would have been unimaginable in civilian medicine. Her instructors noted her natural ability to stay calm under pressure and her exceptional skill in trauma medicine. Sarah discovered that the same focus and determination that had helped her save her brother years earlier were even stronger now. The first thing that hit Sarah when she stepped off the transport plane at Bagram Airfield was the smell. Dust, diesel fuel, and something else she couldn't identify but would later learn was the scent of a war zone. The landscape around her looked like something from another planet, with brown mountains rising up against a pale sky and nothing green as far as she could see. The February air was cold and thin, making her catch her breath as she grabbed her gear and followed the other soldiers toward their assigned transportation. Forward Operating Base Chapman sat in a valley surrounded by rocky hills and ancient-looking villages. The base itself was a collection of concrete barriers, prefabricated buildings, and military vehicles arranged in a defensive pattern that spoke of constant danger. Guard towers rose at strategic points around the perimeter, and Sarah could see soldiers with rifles keeping watch 24 hours a day. The medical facility where Sarah would work was more advanced than she had expected. The main treatment area had modern surgical equipment, digital monitors, and supplies that would have been adequate for most civilian hospitals. Captain Moore had been right when she said that military medicine often pushed the boundaries of what was possible under difficult conditions. The medical team included doctors, nurses, and medics from various units, all working together to provide care for both American forces and Afghan civilians. Sarah's first weeks at Chapman were spent learning the rhythm of life in a combat zone. Every day began before dawn with physical training, followed by equipment checks, medical supply inventory, and training exercises. The base received wounded soldiers and civilians regularly, and Sarah quickly gained experience treating injuries she had only read about during her training. Gunshot wounds, blast injuries, and trauma cases that would have been rare in civilian medicine were routine here. The other members of her medical team became like family to Sarah. There was Staff Sergeant Rodriguez from California, a veteran medic on his 3rd deployment who taught her practical tricks for working in field conditions. Specialist Johnson from Alabama had been an emergency room technician before joining the Army and shared her knowledge of trauma procedures. Private First Class Kim from Hawaii was new like Sarah, but had grown up as the daughter of military parents and understood the unique challenges of deployment life. As spring arrived and the weather warmed, the pace of operations increased. Sarah began going on medical evacuation missions, riding in armored vehicles to pick up wounded soldiers from remote outposts and patrol bases. These missions took her outside the relative safety of Chapman and into areas where the Taliban maintained a strong presence. Each trip was potentially dangerous, but Sarah found that focusing on her medical duties helped her manage the fear that came with traveling through hostile territory. Her first real taste of combat medicine came in April when her ambulance team was called to evacuate 2 soldiers who had been injured by an improvised explosive device while on patrol. The helicopter that would normally handle medical evacuations was grounded for maintenance, so ground transport was the only option. Sarah and her team loaded their armored ambulance with emergency medical supplies and set out for the remote outpost where the wounded men were waiting. The ride to the outpost took them through a winding mountain road that offered perfect hiding spots for enemy fighters. Sarah sat in the back of the ambulance, checking and rechecking her medical equipment while trying to ignore the tension she could feel from the other soldiers. The vehicle commander kept up constant radio contact with the outpost, getting updates on the condition of the wounded and the security situation in the area. When they arrived, Sarah saw her first serious combat injuries. One soldier had shrapnel wounds in his legs and chest, while the other had suffered a traumatic brain injury from the blast. Working quickly and efficiently, Sarah and her team stabilized both patients for transport. The soldier with the head injury was unconscious and required constant monitoring, while the other man was awake, but in severe pain from his wounds. The return trip to Chapman became a race against time. The soldier with the brain injury began showing signs of increased intracranial pressure, a life-threatening condition that required immediate surgery. Sarah worked in the cramped back of the moving ambulance, monitoring vital signs, adjusting medications, and communicating with the doctors at Chapman about the patient's conditions. Every bump in the road and every turn of the vehicle made her work more difficult, but she maintained her focus on keeping both men alive until they reached definitive medical care. Both soldiers survived and were eventually evacuated to better-equipped medical facilities in Germany. Sarah's quick thinking and skilled care during the transport had played a crucial role in saving their lives. Captain Moore praised her performance and noted in her evaluation that Sarah had demonstrated exceptional ability under pressure. For Sarah, the mission reinforced her belief that she was exactly where she needed to be, using her skills to make a real difference in people's lives. As summer approached, the security situation in the region began to deteriorate. Intelligence reports indicated that Taliban forces were planning increased attacks on American and Afghan government targets. Sarah noticed changes in the daily routine at Chapman. Patrols became larger and more heavily armed, security protocols were tightened, and medical personnel were given additional training in defensive procedures. Despite the increased tension, Sarah continued to excel in her role. She was promoted to private first class ahead of schedule and was given additional responsibilities in managing medical supplies and training newer medics. Her reputation for staying calm under pressure and providing excellent patient care made her a respected member of the medical team. In June, Sarah volunteered for a special assignment that would take her even further from the safety of Chapman. A small outpost called Firebase Phoenix, located in a strategically important valley, needed a medic to replace one who had been injured in a rocket attack. The assignment would last for 2 weeks, during which Sarah would be the primary medical provider for the 30 soldiers stationed at the remote location. Firebase Phoenix was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. The outpost was essentially a fortified position on a hilltop, surrounded by sandbags, concrete barriers, and razor wire. The living conditions were primitive, with soldiers sleeping in small bunkers and sharing basic facilities. The nearest major medical facility was Chapman, more than an hour away by ground transport through dangerous territory. The soldiers at Phoenix were part of an infantry company. The morning of August 15th started like any other at Firebase Phoenix. Sarah completed her routine medical equipment check, reviewed the patrol schedule with the platoon leaders, and prepared medications for soldiers who needed daily treatments. The distant explosions she had heard earlier seemed to have stopped, and the intelligence reports suggested the attacks had been focused on positions further south. Phoenix appeared to be safely outside the area of enemy activity. At 0800 hours, Sarah received a radio call that would change everything. A joint patrol of American and Afghan forces had been ambushed while returning to a nearby outpost. Multiple casualties were reported, and the patrol was requesting immediate medical evacuation. However, the landing zone near the ambush site was still under enemy fire, making helicopter evacuation impossible. Ground transport would be necessary to reach the wounded and bring them back to Phoenix for treatment. Sarah quickly gathered her medical gear while the outpost commander organized a rescue convoy. 2 armored Humvees would make the trip, carrying additional soldiers to secure the area and provide covering fire if needed. Sarah would ride in the second vehicle with Sergeant First Class Williams, a veteran medic who had been assigned to Phoenix just the week before. The plan was simple: reach the ambush site, treat the wounded, load them into the vehicles, and return to Phoenix as quickly as possible. The convoy left Firebase Phoenix at 0830 hours, following a dirt road that wound through rocky hills and small villages. Sarah sat in the back of the armored ambulance, monitoring radio communications and mentally reviewing trauma procedures. The patrol that had been ambushed included soldiers she knew from previous missions, and she was determined to provide them with the best possible medical care. As they approached the ambush site, Sarah could see smoke rising from several vehicles and hear the distant sound of gunfire. The patrol had taken cover behind their damaged Humvees and was engaged in a firefight with Taliban forces positioned in the hills above the road. The scene was chaotic, with bullets flying in multiple directions and wounded soldiers calling for help while their comrades returned fire. Sarah's convoy stopped about 200 meters from the ambush site, using the terrain for cover while assessing the situation. The convoy commander established radio contact with the embattled patrol and learned that they had 3 seriously wounded soldiers and 2 with minor injuries. The enemy forces were positioned on both sides of the road, making any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. The plan was for the security team from Sarah's convoy to provide covering fire while she and Sergeant Williams moved forward to treat the wounded. Once the patients were stabilized, they would be moved back to the armored ambulance for transport to Phoenix. It was a dangerous plan, but it was the only way to reach the wounded soldiers in time to save their lives. Sarah checked her medical equipment one final time and made sure her protective vest was properly secured. Sergeant Williams reviewed the approach route and confirmed radio frequencies with the other medics. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of their vehicle, Sarah felt the familiar calm focus that had served her well during previous emergencies. Her training had prepared her for this moment, and she was ready to do whatever was necessary to save lives. The movement to the ambush site was the longest 200 meters of Sarah's life. She and Sergeant Williams ran in short bursts, using rocks and damaged vehicles for cover while enemy bullets whistled overhead. The sound of gunfire was deafening, and Sarah could see muzzle flashes from Taliban positions in the hills around them. But her focus remained on reaching the wounded soldiers and providing them with medical care. The first casualty Sarah reached was a young soldier from Texas named Private Rodriguez, who had taken shrapnel to his abdomen from a rocket-propelled grenade explosion. He was conscious, but losing blood rapidly, and Sarah immediately began working to control the bleeding and establish a 4-line for fluid replacement. Working under fire in the confined space behind the damaged vehicle, Sarah performed emergency procedures that she had practiced hundreds of times in training, but never under such intense conditions. While Sarah treated Rodriguez, Sergeant Williams moved to help a soldier with a serious leg injury. The wounded man had been shot through the thigh, and the bullet had severed a major artery. Williams worked quickly to apply a tourniquet and pressure dressing while bullets continued to impact the ground around them. The enemy fire was becoming more accurate, and it was clear that the rescue team needed to evacuate the wounded soldiers as quickly as possible. As Sarah finished stabilizing Rodriguez for transport, she heard Sergeant Williams call out in pain. A sniper bullet had found its mark, striking Williams in the shoulder and spinning him around before he collapsed behind the vehicle. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that she was now the only medic on the ground, responsible for treating multiple wounded soldiers while under heavy enemy fire. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The covering fire from Sarah's security team was keeping most of the enemy fighters pinned down, but the sniper was still active and picking off anyone who exposed themselves. Sarah had to make a decision: try to treat all the wounded where they were and risk losing them to continued enemy fire, or attempt to move them to the ambulance one at a time. Sarah chose the more dangerous option. Using her radio, she coordinated with the security team to provide covering fire while she moved the wounded soldiers. The first trip was with Rodriguez, who was the most seriously injured. Sarah half-carried, half-dragged the wounded soldier across the open ground to the ambulance, exposing herself to enemy fire for several long seconds. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet, and she could hear the distinctive crack of rounds passing close to her head. Once Rodriguez was loaded into the ambulance, Sarah made the dangerous trip back to the ambush site. Sergeant Williams was still conscious despite his shoulder wound, and he had managed to stabilize the soldier with the leg injury. Sarah helped move both men to the ambulance, making 2 more trips across the deadly ground while enemy fighters continued to pour fire into the area. The last casualty was a soldier named Corporal Jensen, who had been knocked unconscious by an explosion and was showing signs of a serious head injury. Sarah knew that moving an unconscious patient with a potential spinal injury was extremely risky, but leaving him at the ambush site would be fatal. With help from one of the security team members, she carefully placed Jensen on a stretcher and began the most dangerous trip yet. Halfway to the ambulance, the enemy sniper found them again. Sarah's hand closed around the grip of the fallen M4 rifle, and for a split second, she hesitated. The weight of the weapon felt foreign in her hands, so different from the medical instruments she was accustomed to holding. But as another sniper bullet struck the rock just inches from Corporal Jensen's head, spraying sharp fragments across his unconscious face, Sarah's hesitation vanished. She had trained with this weapon during basic training and medical school, but firing at paper targets on a peaceful range was nothing like what she faced now. The sniper who was trying to kill her wounded patients was positioned somewhere in the rocky hills above the road, using the high ground to pick off anyone who moved. Sarah needed to locate the shooter and either eliminate him or force him to take cover long enough for her to get Jensen to the ambulance. Carefully peering around the edge of the rock, Sarah scanned the hillside for any sign of the sniper's position. Years of hunting with her father in the Texas Hill Country had taught her to look for unnatural movements, unusual shadows, and anything that didn't belong in the natural landscape. After several tense moments, she spotted a glint of metal among some rocks about 300 meters up the hill. It was a long shot for someone with her limited combat experience, but it was the only chance she had. Sarah checked the rifle's safety and chambered around, her hands moving with surprising steadiness despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. She had always been naturally accurate with firearms, a skill that had impressed her instructors during military training. But this was different from any shooting she had ever done before. This time, there was a human being at the other end of her sights, someone who was actively trying to kill wounded soldiers under her care. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Sarah aimed carefully at the position where she had seen the glint of metal. She couldn't see the sniper clearly, but she could estimate his location based on the angle of the incoming fire. Her father had taught her that sometimes you had to shoot at where you thought the target was, not where you could see it clearly. Sarah squeezed the trigger slowly and deliberately, feeling the rifle buck against her shoulder as the round left the barrel. Her first shot missed its target, but it accomplished something almost as important. The sniper, suddenly, realizing that someone was shooting back at him with accuracy, stopped firing and took cover. Sarah had bought herself a few precious seconds, and she used them to grab Jensen's stretcher and begin dragging him toward the ambulance. The reprieve was short-lived. After about 30 seconds, the sniper resumed firing, and Sarah was forced to take cover again behind another rock outcropping. But this time, she was closer to the ambulance and had a better angle on the sniper's position. More importantly, she was beginning to understand something about herself that she had never known before. The fear was still there, but it was controlled now, channeled into a cold determination that allowed her to think clearly and act decisively. Sarah fired 3 more carefully aimed shots at the sniper's position, and this time she was rewarded with the sight of a figure falling backward among the rocks. She couldn't tell if she had killed the man or simply wounded him, but the incoming fire stopped completely. Using the momentary quiet, Sarah dragged Jensen the remaining distance to the ambulance and loaded him inside with the other wounded soldiers. Sergeant Williams, despite his wounded shoulder, had been monitoring the radio and coordinating with the security team. He looked at Sarah with a mixture of surprise and respect as she climbed into the ambulance. "Nice shooting, Martinez," he said quietly. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was too focused on checking the vital signs of her patients and preparing them for the ride back to Firebase Phoenix. But as the convoy began moving away from the ambush site, she finally responded. "My dad taught me to hunt when I was a kid," she said. "I guess I never forgot how to aim." The trip back to Phoenix took on a surreal quality for Sarah. In the space of less than an hour, she had gone from being a medic focused purely on healing to someone who had shot and possibly killed an enemy fighter. The rational part of her mind understood that she had done what was necessary to protect her patients, but The emotional impact of crossing that line was something she wasn't prepared for. Back at Firebase Phoenix, Sarah threw herself into treating the wounded soldiers. Rodriguez required emergency surgery to repair damage to his abdomen, and Sarah assisted the base surgeon while maintaining radio contact with a surgical team at a larger medical facility. Jensen remained unconscious, but his vital signs were stable, and a helicopter medical evacuation was finally possible now that the immediate danger had passed. Over the next few hours, all of the wounded soldiers were successfully evacuated to more advanced medical facilities. Rodriguez and Jensen would both make full recoveries, thanks in large part to Sarah's quick thinking and skilled medical care under impossible conditions. Sergeant Williams would be back on duty within a few weeks, and the soldier with the leg wound would retain full use of his injured limb. But for Sarah, the real challenge was just beginning. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the military community in the region. A medic who had engaged enemy fighters to protect her patients was an unusual story, and it caught the attention of commanders and fellow soldiers throughout the area. Some praised her courage and initiative, while others questioned whether a medic should have been involved in direct combat. The official investigation into the incident was routine and quickly concluded that Sarah's actions had been appropriate and necessary. She had been faced with an impossible situation and had responded with courage and skill to protect the lives of wounded soldiers under her care. The Army commended her for exceptional performance under fire and recommended her for a Bronze Star Medal with Valor device. But the recognition and awards didn't change the fundamental shift that had occurred in Sarah's understanding of herself and her role as a soldier. She had discovered that she possessed capabilities she never knew existed, abilities that went beyond medical training and included the capacity for deadly force when necessary. The gentle hands that had been trained to heal could also grip a rifle with deadly accuracy when the situation demanded it. More importantly, Sarah had learned something about the nature of evil and the sometimes violent responses it required. The enemy fighters who had been trying to kill wounded soldiers weren't interested in mercy or medical neutrality. They saw any American as a target, regardless of whether that person was carrying a rifle or a stethoscope. In that environment, Sarah realized, sometimes protecting life required taking life. The psychological impact of this realization was significant. Sarah began experiencing nightmares about the ambush, replaying the moment when she had fired at the sniper over and over again. She found herself constantly alert, scanning her surroundings for threats even when she was in the relative safety of Firebase Phoenix. The hypervigilance that had served her well during the ambush became a persistent source of stress during quiet moments. Captain Moore, who had flown to Phoenix to check on Sarah after hearing about the incident, recognized the signs of combat stress immediately. She arranged for Sarah to speak with a military psychologist and made sure she understood that her reactions were normal responses to an abnormal situation. Many soldiers, the psychologist explained, struggled with the transition from peace to combat, especially those who had joined the military for humanitarian rather than purely martial reasons. As August turned into September, Sarah gradually came to word of Sarah's actions during the ambush spread throughout the American military network in Afghanistan like wildfire. Within weeks, she had earned a nickname that would follow her for the rest of her career, Doc Guardian. Fellow soldiers began requesting her for dangerous missions, knowing that a medic who would fight to protect her patients was exactly the kind of person they wanted watching their backs in hostile territory. But the increased attention also brought new challenges and responsibilities. Sarah found herself assigned to increasingly dangerous missions as commanders recognized her unique combination of medical expertise and combat capability. In September, she was temporarily assigned to a special operations unit that was conducting raids against high-value Taliban targets in remote mountain regions where traditional medical evacuation was impossible. The special operations soldiers were initially skeptical of working with a medic who had only recently seen her first combat. These were hardened veterans who had been fighting in Afghanistan for years, and they had little patience for anyone who couldn't keep up with their demanding pace of operations. But Sarah's reputation had preceded her, and the team leader, Master Sergeant David Chun, was willing to give her a chance to prove herself. The first mission with the Special Operations Team took Sarah deeper into enemy territory than she had ever been before. The target was a Taliban commander who was responsible for planning attacks against American forces in the region. Intelligence indicated that he was hiding in a fortified compound in a remote valley, surrounded by loyal fighters who would not surrender easily. Sarah's role was to provide medical support during the raid and to treat any casualties that might result from the operation. But, as the team prepared for the mission, Master Sergeant Chen made it clear that every member of the team needed to be ready to fight if the situation demanded it. There would be no non-combatants on this mission, and Sarah's medical training would not exempt her from participating in the assault if necessary. The raid itself was a masterpiece of military precision and violence. The Special Operations Team moved through the darkness like shadows, using night vision equipment and coordinated tactics to overwhelm the compound's defenses before the enemy could mount an effective resistance. Sarah accompanied the team as they cleared buildings and searched for their target, her medical equipment ready for immediate use, but her rifle equally prepared for action. The Taliban commander was captured alive along with several of his subordinates, but not before a fierce firefight that left 3 American soldiers wounded and several enemy fighters dead. Sarah's medical skills were immediately put to test as she treated gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and blast trauma in the chaotic aftermath of the raid. Working by the light of tactical flashlights while the sounds of sporadic gunfire echoed through the compound, Sarah stabilized all 3 wounded Americans and ensured they would survive the helicopter evacuation that followed. Master Sergeant Chen's assessment of Sarah's performance was brief but telling. "She's not a medic who can fight," he told his commanding officer. "She's a warrior who happens to be a medic. There's a big difference." As fall turned to winter, Sarah's reputation continued to grow. She was awarded the Bronze Star Medal with Valor Device for her actions during the August ambush, and her citation specifically mentioned her extraordinary courage under fire and selfless dedication to protecting wounded soldiers. But, more importantly to Sarah, she had found her true calling as a soldier who could serve equally well as a healer and a fighter. The psychological transformation that had begun during the ambush was now complete. Sarah no longer struggled with nightmares or guilt about her actions in combat. Instead, she had developed a warrior's mindset that allowed her to compartmentalize the violence while remaining emotionally connected to her mission of saving lives. She understood that the 2 roles were not contradictory, but complementary aspects of serving in a combat zone. In December, Sarah volunteered for the most dangerous assignment of her deployment, a long-range patrol mission into the mountains near the Pakistan border, where Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters maintained training camps and supply routes. The mission would last 2 weeks and would take a small team of soldiers deep into territory where American forces rarely operated. The patrol was led by Captain James Morrison, an infantry officer with extensive experience in mountain warfare. The team included 8 soldiers specially selected for their expertise in long-range reconnaissance, survival skills, and combat effectiveness. Sarah was the only medic on the mission, responsible for keeping the team healthy and combat-ready in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The mountain patrol began in the 3rd week of December, as winter weather was beginning to make the high passes nearly impassable. The team moved on foot through terrain that ranged from rocky valleys to snow-covered peaks, carrying everything they would need for 2 weeks of independent operations. Sarah's pack included not only medical supplies, but also her share of ammunition, food, and survival equipment. On the 4th day of the patrol, the team made contact with a large group of enemy fighters who were using a remote valley as a staging area for attacks into Afghanistan. What should have been a quick reconnaissance mission turned into a running battle as the Americans found themselves outnumbered and surrounded in hostile territory. For the next 3 days, Sarah's team fought a series of engagements while trying to reach an extraction point where helicopters could evacuate them. The enemy forces seemed to know the terrain better than the Americans, and they used their numerical advantage to try to pin down the patrol in areas where air support couldn't reach them effectively. During the heaviest fighting, Sarah proved that her transformation from medic to warrior was complete. She moved between wounded soldiers under heavy fire, providing medical care while simultaneously engaging enemy targets with her rifle. When the team's radio operator was seriously wounded, Sarah took over communications duties while continuing to treat casualties and fight off enemy attacks. On the seventh day, when the team was finally extracted by helicopter, Sarah had treated 4 seriously wounded soldiers, participated in more than a dozen firefights, and, according to her fellow soldiers, had personally accounted for at least 6 enemy casualties. More importantly, all members of the patrol survived and returned home safely, thanks in large part to Sarah's medical expertise and combat effectiveness. Captain Morrison's recommendation for Sarah's second Bronze Star was endorsed by every level of command up to the theater commander. But the citation that meant the most to Sarah came from one of the wounded soldiers she had treated during the mountain patrol. "Doc Guardian saved my life 3 times in 1 week," he wrote. "Once when she patched up my wounds under fire, once when she carried me to cover while shooting back at the guys trying to kill us, and once when she stayed awake all night monitoring my condition while we waited for evacuation. She's not just a medic, she's a guardian angel with a rifle." When Sarah's deployment ended in February 2021, she had served in more combat missions than many infantry soldiers and had earned a reputation as one of the most effective combat medics in the entire theater. But, more importantly, she had discovered something about herself that would shape the rest of her life. The understanding that true service sometimes required the courage to step beyond the boundaries of your assigned role and become whatever was needed to protect the people counting on you. Returning to the United States after her deployment, Sarah faced the challenge of readjusting to peacetime military service. She was assigned to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where she worked in the base hospital while continuing to train for potential future deployments. But her experiences in Afghanistan had changed her fundamentally, and she found it difficult to return to routine medical duties after the intensity of combat operations. Sarah began speaking at military medical conferences about her experiences as a combat medic, sharing lessons learned about providing medical care under fire and the importance of combat training for all military medical personnel. Her presentations were popular with audiences of doctors, nurses, and medics who were preparing for their own deployments to combat zones. In 2022, Sarah was accepted for training as a physician assistant, a program that would allow her to advance her medical career while remaining in the military. She completed the rigorous academic program while continuing to serve as a mentor for younger medics who were preparing for deployment. Her combination of combat experience and medical expertise made her an invaluable teacher and role model. As she prepared to graduate from physician assistant school, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small town in Texas to becoming one of the most decorated medics in recent military history. The gentle girl who had wanted nothing more than to save lives had discovered that sometimes saving lives required the courage to take them. The hands that had been trained to heal had proven equally capable of wielding weapons when necessary. But, perhaps most importantly, Sarah had learned that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of fear when action was necessary to protect others. Whether she was treating wounded soldiers under fire or engaging enemy combatants to protect her patients, Sarah had consistently chosen to put the welfare of others before her own safety. Today, Major Sarah Martinez serves as a physician assistant at Walter Reed Medical Center, where she treats wounded veterans returning from combat zones around the world. On her uniform, she wears the Bronze Star Medal with Valor device, the Combat Medical Badge, and other decorations that tell the story of her service in Afghanistan. But the decoration she treasures most is a small pin given to her by the soldiers she served with during her deployment, a medical cross surrounded by crossed rifles, with the words "Doc Guardian" inscribed below. Sarah's story has become part of military medical training, taught to new medics as an example of the courage and adaptability required for service in combat zones. But, for Sarah herself, the story is simply about a young woman who was faced with impossible choices and found the strength to do whatever was necessary to protect the people counting on her. The girl from Kingsville, Texas, had become a legend, but she had never forgotten the simple truth that had guided her from the beginning. Sometimes the greatest act of healing requires the courage to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. In a world where evil exists and threatens innocent people, warriors like Sarah Martinez stand ready to heal the wounded and fight the darkness, proving that the same hands can hold both a stethoscope and a rifle with equal skill and dedication. Terms with what had happened and what it meant for her future as a soldier. She remained committed to her role as a medic, but she also understood now that being a medic in a combat zone meant being prepared for combat itself. She began requesting additional weapons training and studying tactical procedures that would help her protect her patients more effectively. Her reputation as a medic who would fight for her patients spread throughout the region, and other medical personnel began seeking her advice on how to handle similar situations. Sarah found herself becoming an informal leader among the medics, someone who understood both the healing and fighting aspects of military medicine. But the biggest change was in Sarah's understanding of courage. Before the ambush, she had thought of courage primarily in medical terms, the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure, to stay calm during medical emergencies, and to persevere through long hours of demanding work. Now she understood that courage sometimes required a willingness to step outside your defined role and do whatever was necessary to protect the people counting on you. The girl from Kingsville, Texas, who had wanted nothing more than to save lives, had become something more complex and powerful. She was still a healer, but she was also a warrior when necessary. And as her deployment in Afghanistan continued, Sarah would discover that this dual nature would be tested again and again in ways that would forge her into one of the most respected and feared medics in the entire theater of operations. A security team member helping Sarah was hit in the arm, causing him to drop his end of the stretcher. Sarah found herself alone in the middle of the open ground, holding an unconscious soldier on a stretcher while bullets whistled around her. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her as she realized how exposed and vulnerable she was. But instead of giving in to fear, Sarah felt something she had never experienced before. A cold, determined anger filled her chest as she looked at the wounded soldier on the stretcher and realized that enemy fighters were actively trying to kill wounded men who posed no threat to anyone. The same hands that had dedicated themselves to healing were now faced with evil that seemed determined to destroy everything she stood for. Still holding one end of the stretcher, Sarah managed to drag Jensen behind a large rock that offered some protection from the sniper. She could see the ambulance only 50 meters away, but it might as well have been on the other side of the world. The enemy fire was too accurate, and she couldn't move Jensen safely by herself. As she considered her options, Sarah noticed something that changed everything. One of the wounded soldiers from the original patrol had dropped his rifle during the initial ambush, and the weapon was lying just a few feet from her position. Sarah had been trained in basic rifle marksmanship during her military training, but she had never considered using a weapon in combat. She was a medic, a healer, someone who saved lives rather than taking them. But as another burst of sniper fire scattered rocks around Jensen's unconscious form, Sarah realized that sometimes saving lives required more than medical training. If she couldn't get the wounded soldiers to safety, they would all die. And if that meant picking up a rifle and fighting back against the people trying to kill her patients, then that was what she would have to do. Sarah's transformation from healer to warrior was about to begin, though she didn't yet realize it. As she reached for the fallen rifle, her hand trembling slightly with adrenaline and determination, she was crossing a line that would change her forever. The gentle girl from Texas who had wanted nothing more than to save lives was about to discover that sometimes the greatest act of healing required the willingness to fight. I conducted daily patrols in the surrounding area, gathering intelligence and working with local Afghan forces. They faced constant threats from snipers, improvised explosive devices, and direct attacks from Taliban fighters. Medical emergencies had to be handled on-site until helicopter evacuation could be arranged, and helicopter evacuations were often delayed or canceled due to enemy fire. During her first week at Phoenix, Sarah treated a variety of medical issues ranging from dehydration and heat exhaustion to cuts and sprains from patrol activities. She also learned about the unique challenges of providing medical care in such an isolated location. Medical supplies had to be carefully managed because resupply missions were infrequent and dangerous. Equipment had to be maintained in harsh conditions with limited resources. Most importantly, Sarah had to be prepared to handle serious trauma cases with minimal support. The soldiers at Phoenix initially viewed Sarah with curiosity and perhaps some skepticism. She was young, new to deployment, and obviously different from the grizzled infantry soldiers who made up most of the outpost's population. But her professional competence and calm demeanor quickly earned their respect. When Private Martinez from 2nd Platoon severely cut his hand on a piece of metal during a construction project, Sarah's quick and skillful treatment prevented a serious infection and saved him from losing the use of several fingers. As her second week at Phoenix began, Sarah noticed increased enemy activity in the area. Radio communications intercepted by intelligence specialists suggested that Taliban forces were planning some kind of operation against American positions. Patrol schedules were adjusted, security measures were increased, and all personnel were reminded of emergency procedures. Sarah used the additional time to double-check her medical supplies and equipment. She organized her aid station to ensure that everything would be readily accessible in an emergency, and she reviewed trauma procedures with the combat lifesavers in each platoon. Something in the air felt different, and her instincts told her that the relative quiet of the past few days might not last much longer. On the morning of August 15, 2020, Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of distant explosions. Enemy forces had launched coordinated attacks on several American positions throughout the region, and Firebase Phoenix was directly in their path. As she grabbed her medical gear and prepared to respond to whatever casualties might result, Sarah had no idea that she was about to face the greatest test of her life. The skills she had learned, the training she had received, and the courage she had developed were all about to be pushed to their absolute limits in ways she never could have imagined. After completing her medical training, Sarah was assigned to Fort Stewart, Georgia, as part of the 3rd Infantry Division. Her unit was a forward support medical company, responsible for providing emergency medical care and evacuation services in combat zones. Sarah loved working with the other medics and soldiers in her unit. They came from all over the country, bringing different backgrounds and experiences, but they were united by their commitment to saving lives and taking care of each other. For the first year of her service, Sarah worked in the base hospital, treating everything from training injuries to emergency medical situations. She gained experience with advanced medical equipment, learned to work efficiently in high-stress environments, and developed the quick decision-making skills that would prove crucial later. Her supervising physician, Captain Jennifer Moore, became a mentor and friend, teaching Sarah advanced trauma techniques and encouraging her to pursue additional medical certifications. In late 2019, Sarah received news that would change everything. Her unit was being deployed to Afghanistan. After nearly 18 years of war, American forces were still working to stabilize the country and support the Afghan government. Sarah's medical company would be stationed at Forward Operating Base Chapman in eastern Afghanistan, providing medical support for combat operations and humanitarian missions in the region. The deployment preparation was intensive. Sarah trained in desert survival, learned about the cultural and political situation in Afghanistan, and practiced medical procedures specific to combat injuries. She studied the types of wounds commonly caused by improvised explosive devices, gunshots, and shrapnel, learning techniques that could mean the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers. As her deployment date approached, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She was eager to use her training to help people in a real combat environment, but she also understood the dangers she would face. Her parents worried constantly, but they were also proud of the skilled medical professional their daughter had become. Sarah's brother Carlos, now a senior in high school, told everyone he met about his sister, the Army medic who was going to save lives in Afghanistan. On a cold February morning in 2020, Sarah boarded a military transport plane at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, bound for Afghanistan. As the plane lifted off, carrying her toward a war zone thousands of miles from home, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a small town in Texas to the mountains of Afghanistan, every step had prepared her for the challenges ahead. She had no way of knowing that within 6 months, she would face a test that would require not just her medical skills, but every ounce of courage and determination she possessed. The gentle hands that had been trained to heal would soon be forced to take up arms in defense of the lives she had sworn to protect. But, in that moment, flying through the darkness toward an uncertain future, Sarah Martinez was simply a dedicated medic, ready to serve her country and save lives in one of the most dangerous places on Earth.